everyone. Welcome, welcome. My name is Shabnam, and I'm the audience director at PRISM. Very excited to host you all and to host these panelists. So moderating our panel today is Laura Albast. She is a Palestinian journalist, editor, translator, photographer, and media analyst. Her publications and appearances include The Washington Post, The Nation, Al Jazeera, The Market, The Markup, and TRT World, among other outlets. Laura served as the senior editor of digital strategy and communications at the Institute for Palestine Studies, USA, in Washington, D.C. for 6 years. As the editor of Palestine Square, the Institute's blog, she published 500 plus stories covering Palestinian affairs, culture, and politics. Iman Mohammed is a Palestinian journalist from Gaza and a senior TED fellow. She began her work at 19, documenting the people of Palestine under Israeli occupation and siege, centering the stories of resistance, survival, and truth. Her photographs and investigations have been published worldwide, recognized for dismantling colonial narratives by The Guardian, NPR, and I'm going to butcher this name, the Ing Feltrinelli Foundation. Sorry. Aline Batarse joined the Visualizing Palestine team as executive director in 2021. She has more than 20 years of experience working with several Palestinian and international nonprofits at the intersections of gender equality, reproductive justice, children's rights, mental health, and social justice. Sana Saeed is a DC-based award-winning media writer and critic, previously with AJ Plus, where she hosted the media critique series Backspace and the Israeli Occupation Style Guide. Sana has over 15 years of experience covering the U.S. news media as it intersects with Islam, the Global South, and U.S. foreign policy with a focus on Palestine. Since October 2023, her work has notably focused on U.S. foreign policy and news media coverage of the U.S.-backed Israeli genocide of Palestinians. Finally, we have Abdallah Fayyad, who is a journalist who has worked at Vox, the Boston Globe, and the Atlantic. He covers a broad range of topics from issues around race, class, and democracy in the U.S. to Israel's occupation of Palestine. In 2022, he was named a Pulitzer Prize finalist. I'm very excited to hear this conversation and be with you all today. And Laura, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Shabnam, and thank you, PRISM, for hosting this today. Thank you, Visualizing Palestine, and thank you to our panelists for having this important conversation, especially today. For everyone watching us, my name is Laura Albast. I am a journalist and editor. My grandmother, Nawal, who is a refugee, a teacher, and a dressmaker, passed away 2 days ago. Allah yarhamha. But I still wanted to be here with you as we mark 2 years of the genocide in Gaza. My grandmother survived the Nakba, and she would have wanted me to be steadfast in continuing to preserve the memory of generations while working to document the present. We have reached 2 years of an ongoing, relentless genocide conducted by a criminal Israeli regime. Israel has killed more than 67,000 Palestinians in Gaza, and that's just the number that we can count. There are hundreds of thousands that are missing, that are left uncounted under the rubble, that we cannot look for, that we do not know their names. Israel has destroyed vast infrastructure. They have tortured doctors. They have kidnapped people. They have made it nearly impossible to rescue residents. They have made it impossible to survive. Estimates today are in the hundreds of thousands, and of them, at least 278 Palestinian journalists in Gaza have been killed. They've been targeted, they've been intimidated with their families. Israel has also imposed a media blackout in several areas in the Strip, making it impossible for us to learn about news that is coming out, especially today, especially in the north. This targeting is deliberate. It has turned the press vest into a target. It has turned journalism into a crime. And Western journalists in particular, and those in U.S. newsrooms, have aided in these murders. So when Israel accused 6 Al Jazeera journalists, for example, of being fighters, American newsrooms parroted the accusation, almost encouraging their murder. 2 of our colleagues, Hussam and Anas, have been killed, and at least 1 has been injured. This is just one example of the many lies that have been published and amplified in U.S. newsrooms. as an excuse to reload the guns and warplanes with ammunition and bombs, to make weapon manufacturers richer. And for some of these lies, we've seen newsrooms backtrack without correction or apology, like the New York Times, which we do talk about, while others are adorned by international awards and recognition. They have manufactured consent for the genocide in Gaza. They have championed Israeli propaganda narratives that justify this ongoing genocide. And today we talk about pro-Israel bias, but I think that bias is too mundane a word to describe the deliberate silencing of truth tellers, the manipulation of facts, and the blind allegiance to a Zionist regime. Often in our journalism industry, people refer to this simple analogy, which might sound silly, but if someone tells you it's raining and another tells you it's not, your job as a journalist isn't to quote them both. It's to stick your head out the window, to step outside the door and just look. Israel has been raining bombs in Gaza for 730 days nonstop. If they're not striking from the sky, they're shooting at aid seekers, they're kidnapping people, they're blocking the entry of food, they're creating a man-made famine, they're creating a man-made hell. We are still able to report on this accurately even today. So in January, I embarked on an investigation with PRISM and Visualizing Palestine, and my aim wasn't to uncover whether there was bias in U.S. newsrooms. We know there is. Not whether there was anti-Palestinian racism. We know there is. But rather to look and uncover at how it was done. What were the editorial policies? What were the standards that were upheld? What were the conversations that were had? Who was assigned? Who was not assigned? Who was sidelined? What happened in the newsroom? Is there anyone pushing back? Is there anyone trying to do their job? And I spoke with a nearly dozen journalists. Two of them are with us here today, Iman and Sana. And a lot of the journalists I spoke with were in major newsrooms, local newsrooms, and surprising stories from progressive newsrooms as well, on and off the record. The anecdotes were plenty. We had journalists who were fired or reassigned stories, journalists who were harassed or surveyed in the newsroom, those who had to endure racist remarks and questioned in front of their peers if they can do their job or if they can't, those who had to see others who have close ties to the Israeli regime take the spotlight without question. There was no interest in some newsrooms in even covering the largest catastrophe, the greatest catastrophe of this time and in recent history. Even as audiences flooded the DMs and comment sections to ask for these stories. And this wasn't just a choice of words and headlines. It was also editorial policy, former occupation soldiers leading coverage, Zionist lobby groups harassing journalists and their executives, et cetera, et cetera. And if you are Arab or Muslim or Arab and Muslim presenting, you are even in a more dangerous situation as a journalist in the newsroom. And so before we start this discussion, I just want to note that as journalists, our profession is more than just a day job or a gig. There must be a conviction in telling the stories of our communities and reporting the truth and holding those in power accountable to the masses. I did this investigation with PRISM that is part of the Movement Media Alliance. I know a group of these members are watching right now as well. And it's important to support that, the voices of the masses, the voices of the oppressed. True journalism is the act of documenting history as it disrupts the present. And with that, I ask the first question. We look at the way that the media is covering the genocide at this moment, but this has been ongoing. There has been a pattern that has been going on for a very long time. And so before Israel began its genocide, before October 7, I want to ask our panelists today, what was your perception, consumption, or experience of Palestine coverage in US media then? Iman, if we can start with you.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for being here. عظم الله أجركم. I'm really sorry for your loss. It comes at a time where like grief is just piling. So I really appreciate you being here. I know it's so hard. I know there is no manual to how we can function and just even have a normal panel like this one at such not normal times. I appreciate your question as well, because it's important to look on before the world suddenly discovered Palestinians again and again and again, and noticed that there is an ethnic cleansing campaign being uh, done by the Israeli regime against them. Um, in my experience, I think it became very evident that all through mainstream media, generally speaking, Palestinians did not exist as anything but a security threat. Our stories were always either pushed to be balanced, like two equal parties, clashes, intensifying disputes, as if it's like such an argument, just a heated argument between two neighbors, or it was a security threat, as in like you are the one that has to prove why would you not be killed, why should Palestinians live, why are that was the bar in every newsroom that I've existed in. It's on you to prove that this story is worthy. And one pitch of any story about Palestine that would look like it's not going in mainstream media style as like bias 100% to Israel would get you blacklisted. So that pressure to always have Palestinians appear in at times where resistance would intensify, or like on October 7th, made the mainstream media audience so desensitized, and those who are not desensitized are struggling to remain so. Um, I know that after that, Palestinians, when they finally were discovered by the world, suddenly after October 7th, became um, just trauma porn. Look at these sad babies who are brown, but don't name their killer, don't name the perpetrator, don't name why they are sad, why they are being starved, who starved them, and constantly pushing that tragic as if it just happened. You know, you don't name the doer, so it becomes a humanitarian crisis, which is a term that we hear again and again, and it's just so infuriating because it does the work for the occupier. It just strips all agency of the people of Palestine, and it strips all accountability of the Zionist regime. So no one is accountable for what is happening. So I just believe that it's always been out of balance and out of integrity more than anything, and it comes as shock for a lot of people, but for us as journalists who existed in those spaces and struggled and pushed back on these spaces, and those editors who literally just played into the propaganda willingly and knowingly, it's not shocking at all. It's just about time for the people to understand how misinformed they had been at a time that everything is televised, everything in the palm of your hand, and you can verify it. And it becomes your narrative or their narrative, as if there's no truth. And when there's no truth and there's no base for us to agree on, we're in such a dangerous zone.
Exactly. And for those watching, Prism will share the article in the chat. Iman talked about her experience in particular as a freelance photojournalist with a number of major newsrooms. Senna.
Thanks so much for having me here and for this question. And Laura, also, I want to give my condolences on the loss of your grandmother. Inshallah, that she can see a free Palestine from the heavens one day soon. Regarding this question, I mean, Iman said a lot of what needs to be said and must be said. I will add this is that one of the things that did surprise me. I mean, maybe surprise isn't the right word, but it really, I think it definitely made me like go wow, was the ferocity with which our news media landscape after October 7th of 2023 came together and just decided to forego every basic principle of journalism that you are taught, every basic principle and every basic ethos as well, completely gone. And it wasn't that I was surprised about it, because the reason why that was even able to happen is because that's exactly how that system, right? Our news industry as a system, as an institution, was set up, right? It's been not just 10 years, 15 years, it's been decades of that type of narrative building regarding Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims. We see a lot of the same narratives that are so prominent today in US news media coverage are the same narratives we saw in 1945 and 1946 and 1947 and 1948 and after, about the Arabs who are living in the desert there and so on and so forth, about the savages and how, oh no, they're poor conditions. But look at the pioneers who must defend themselves against the evil fascists of the world who are trying to eradicate them. So we find a lot of narrative continuity throughout the decades. So it's not surprising in that sense. But the ferocity with which our news media came together and just, again, throughout every single, whether it was even basic fact checking, everything, those first 3 months of the genocide, I think, are so fundamental in understanding the media story here, right? Yes, the last 2 years, every single day, we've seen a manufacturing again and again and again and again and again of the case for genocide to justify even positive news stories. Or people will say, by positive I mean, like, oh look, they're trying to they're talking about Palestinian suffering, they're talking, even those things are still couched in the same old, like, as Iman mentioned, the killers are rarely, if ever, mentioned, who are the Israelis, right, who are supported by the Americans. But all of it those first 3 months to me remain the most important, because everything that was lied about, that was taken as truth or presented as truth, is what then sets the stage for how this media story continues even to this day, 2 years later. So I mean, that's I think the most important thing to remember. And also this context is that none of this is new. This is working exactly as it was built to work. But that should not make us still be appalled at the depth of dehumanization, the breadth of dehumanization that has happened every single day for the last 2 years straight.
And it has essentially paved the way for this continuation. Abdullah.
Thanks, Laura, and also want to echo, I'm very sorry for your loss and your family. So thinking of you all, I'm sure this is an extremely difficult time, but really appreciate you making the time to speak with us, and thanks for having us here. I mean, I think Iman and Senna, really covered a lot of the points here. There are a few things that I would add, and going back to the question of what was this like before October 7th. And I think, you would be hard pressed to find a people who had so consistently been dehumanized in the same way that Palestinians had been in the mainstream press in the U.S. Part of the reason I say that is because, the press and the mainstream press kind of has a liberal bias, and that doesn't mean a left bias. That just means, like, Western liberal bias. And part of that meant that part of the mission of journalism in U.S. newsrooms was not just a matter of going out to see if it's raining, if somebody said it's raining and somebody that said it's not, but also it was a mission of, or at least a perceived mission of, justice, that there are these fundamental values to human beings, that our job is to shed light on injustice as journalists, and our job is to shed light on where freedom is infringed upon wherever it is in the world. The question of Palestinians' freedom has never really been something that has been reckoned with in the pages of our newspapers ever. Our freedom as Palestinians has always been viewed in this kind of very abstract way, in a non-human way, a subhuman way. The idea that, for example, we tend to see laundered in a lot of news stories this idea that a free Palestine or a freedom for Palestinians is in and of itself a threat. that is a non-starter if you're covering justice and human rights and fundamental freedom. The idea that our freedom is supposed to be conditioned on anything, that us as a people can't be nuanced or difficult, or that we had to be a noble victim, a perfect victim, in order to be able to acquire our own freedom, that has never, you know, kind of been taken into account. The idea has always been, well, here's what Palestinians should be like in order to be quote unquote free. And then, we get into the question of what that freedom actually looks like. But the basic premise is that it had been a universally accepted truth in the U.S. press that Palestinians didn't inherently deserve their freedom, that our freedom was not inherent to us as human beings, that it was something that we somehow had to earn. And that just shows the lack of complexity and the lack of willingness on the part of a lot of newsrooms to look at Palestinians as equals. Because if we were to cover Americans, if we cover Ukrainians, whoever it is that we cover, we tend to look at them as human beings, or at least we try to look at them as human beings and see that their freedom to self-govern, freedom of mobility, any kind of freedom, that is unconditional, that is inherent. And the things that ought to be covered are the things that are getting in the way of that freedom, the things that are oppressing, and that had never really been focused on. So of course, when something like October 7th happens, the natural response for a lot of these outlets, for practically all of them, was not to look at the complexity of the Palestinian people and understand them as human beings who ought to be free, and free from oppression. But the reaction was that these are not really human beings, that these are people who don't deserve freedom, and that anything that comes their way is justified. And that's why to this day, we still see these untold deaths and destruction of Gaza as something that is somehow justifiable, and it's still abstract, and it erases the human toll, the emotional toll of kind of the humans, the faces behind all the suffering in Gaza, that is still absent. And as Iman mentioned earlier, it's like when it is present, when the human face is present, then we don't know who's doing it. It's a tragedy. It's something that's, our oppression is always happening from some mysterious abstract force from above, as though it's just, like we just drop dead. We're not killed. And you see this time and again, and I've mentioned this many times over the last 2 years, but even when you read, like, in the aftermath of October 7th, stories in Reuters or the New York Times, it describes Israelis who were killed on October 7th as loved ones who were killed, loved ones who were murdered, slaughtered. And then it just says, and since then, 2,000 Palestinians have died, 3,000 Palestinians have died, 5,000 Palestinians have died. None of them were loved ones. None of that emotional attachment, emotional human connection was attached to them. It was just this abstract number that just keeps growing and growing, that does desensitize a reader, that does make us, less relatable to the audience. And I think that's something that has deeply been embedded. I mean, since I was a kid, I remember just how biased the US media was. It was part of the reason I was interested in becoming a journalist to begin with, because, first I was naive and thought, people just don't know the truth, so maybe when they know the truth, we can fix this. But it's so deeply embedded, that I really think, this has just been the natural extension these last 2 years of just the unparalleled dehumanization of Palestinian people as a whole, in the mainstream Western press.
Yeah. Thank you, Abdullah. Aline?
Yeah, thank you, Laura, and thank you, everyone. Everything everyone has said resonates deeply with me. Also wanted to take a moment to pay my condolences to you, Laura. I know that we're all going through so much grief, and then this added grief is really difficult to deal with. And when you mentioned your grandmother, I remembered my grandmother and how, as I was growing up, she used to tell me we used to think that we'd get our property back Like every day they would think that they'd get their property back in 1948, and they never did. And this moment, just, everything that everyone has said resonates because the Nakba is ongoing, the genocide is ongoing, and this genocide is not an incident, it's a process, and we've experienced it before, and we're experiencing it again now. So we all also carry that intergenerational trauma in our bodies, and I feel it in my body every day as this genocide continues. Your question was pre-October 7th. I feel like this piece that we did with Prism, and I want to thank Prism. This was like just an amazing working process with all of you and with you, Laura. Such a great collaboration. Thank you all so much for including us and trusting us in this work. I think I'm also the only non-journalist in this virtual room. And when I think about the piece that we did together, I feel like we could have done this in 2023, pre-October 7th. And the reason I'm saying this is because when I look at visualizing Palestine's priority themes in 2023, one of the themes that we were focused on was actually freedom of expression. And the reason we were focusing on it is because we recognize that as Israel's apartheid grows, and the recognition of apartheid was growing worldwide. Also, Israel and its supporters were using tactics and developing additional tactics to suppress dissent and to silence advocates for Palestinian rights and to silence anyone that's criticizing Israel. So we decided to work on several visuals on this topic. And the first one was on the system of silencing. And it's so interesting because in that visual, and I'll paste it here so that people can take a look at what I'm talking about. We look at all the actors and the systems that are engaged in silencing criticism. And so we look at the Israeli government, we look at the Palestinian Authority, we look at funders at universities, and we look at the media. And this is all pre-October 7th. And alongside that piece, I wrote an article that focuses on major media and the silencing of Palestinian voices in March 2023 for Mondevice. And in that article, the exact same issues that are brought up in your piece for Prism, Laura, is repeated. So in that article, we see, I used some of the study that Maha Nassar did in 2020, where she basically revealed that in the Washington Post, Palestinians wrote only 1% of the pieces, of the opinion pieces from 1970 to 2019. We see that repeated again in terms of who's being sidelined today in reporting, right? How Palestinian voices are sidelined, Palestinian voices are always biased, whereas Israelis or Westerners aren't. There's inherent bias, of Westerners and Israelis as well, but only Palestinians are called out, right? As if objectivity is this, it's like only Westerners can be objective, whereas we know that, even journalists have their writings are colored also by their experience and what they're exposed to within their lifetime. So there's that, and then Maha Nassar also talks about the New York Times and how only 2% of the pieces were written by Palestinians. So again, all of these major media have been silencing Palestinian voices for a very long time, for decades, and this continues to be the case. It's just amplified and on steroids today, and it's in your face today, much more than it was before, because the suffering is undeniable, and yet the media is playing a major role in obscuring a genocide and in manufacturing consent, as you said, Laura, for this genocide. At the same time, in that report, there's also a study by Holly Jackson, an MIT study in 2021, where she reflects on anti-Palestinian bias in the New York Times she looks at the Intifada in 1987 and in 2000, respectively, And in the study, she concludes that over 33,000 articles she analyzes over the 2 periods, less than 50% referenced Palestine or Palestinians, and over 90% referenced Israel or Israelis. And then also there, in terms of when reporters were describing Palestinians and Israelis, there was a higher volume of violent language that described Palestinians versus Israelis, and then passive language that was used to describe Palestinians versus Israelis. And we see that again in the piece that you wrote. So I think what is clear is to us today, as everyone else also said, is this, Palestinians being referred to as numbers, as non-beings, Israelis referred to as human beings. The language that's used to dehumanize Palestinians very clearly is something that continues today, and is something that we need to continue to call out, because it is shaping also perspectives, even though we see that changing as well, right? People are questioning it. Even though there's so much bias now, people are questioning. They're saying, well, how is it that so many people being killed is okay? We're seeing that public perception change, and alongside that, we're seeing repression increase.
No, thank you for sharing that. I remember seeing that visual that you've mentioned, and it does echo a lot of what people have said when I spoke to them, including there's Professor Will Youmans, who did a recent study on the first 3 months, as Sana said, like that really shaped the exploration of the genocide and the narrative, where he looked at Sunday talk shows and how many guests were Palestinian, how many were Israeli, what were the words that were used, et cetera, and most often there is no voice that's really speaking for the Palestinians. And on that, I do want to sort of ask each of you a different question, but please feel free to jump in and jump off each other as well. But Iman, you've had your own experience with newsrooms as a freelance photojournalist. You've had your own relationships with these newsrooms, and then October 7th happens, and all of a sudden, a lot of these relationships are disrupted. Talk to us about that. What did that look like? I really want to touch on the idea of, like, okay, so they've continued to lie, they've continued to dehumanize, they've continued to manufacture consent. What were the specifics of these conversations that were had behind closed doors? What were the relationships with the Democrats, for example, or with the government, or with Israel, that really shaped that narrative? What was your experience? And I think you do name one of the organizations that you had an experience with. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, pitching a Palestinian story, or pitching stories about Palestinians in general, to American media often felt like pitching UFOs. Like, prove it and verify it and make sure that it's done, and then let us know why should we care. And that's like the golden question that I think they just felt a little bit shy to ask at first. Like, why are they human like the rest of us? Explain to us. And when we see it now, there's absolutely no self-awareness, like none. When those same agencies, same news rooms that advocate for freedom of press, and now with Charlie Kirk, like, no, we cannot allow that. Everyone can speak up. And we need to back each other up. That all fizzles away when it comes to Palestine. And I often knew that. I think all Palestinians, or even people who were just had awareness of how the double standards worked, it realized that quickly on. When you have an ex-IDF soldier is an editor-in-chief, like you have in the Atlantic, like, how would that be anything but conflict of absolute interest, if not like malpractice? And then you find every story follows that route. I think I worked very closely with NPR, and now that their politics shifted to not protecting freedom of press, obviously NPR is huge and there are different rooms, but that was my experience, that unless it's absolutely balanced, in the sense that if there was a protest that is a pro-Palestine protest and there isn't an Israeli protest, The pro-Palestine protest does not get coverage, which is insane to say the least, because that's not balance. That's the opposite. That's you completely concealing news on the expense of the fact that other news did not happen. So that's, if that's not bias, I don't know what is. And to have, those were the conversations. The conversations were, sorry, we can't cover pro-Palestine protests because we don't have pro-Israel. And it's like, not my fault that nobody likes those who commit genocide, but you still have the duty to cover as journalists. And we often use that as like an, not even a funny, but an inside joke, that if you cover a story about Syria or Ukraine, that's a career builder. If you cover a story or pitch a story about Palestine, like I just said, that can blacklist you. Like, you have to really thread that line carefully with news editors who pride themselves on being liberal. They would burn their entire career for Black Lives Matter movement or queer rights, but they didn't. And I think that's where we misunderstood and misexplained the whole picture, is that they didn't. They only stood, and the statements rolled, and Black photographers and journalists know that when the Black Lives Matter movement came into the picture. That's when that PR laundering started, and the campaigns just rallied one after the other, and it became very hard to know who's really genuine and who's not at that point. But every group that had been subjected to injustice knows that American media never sided with the truth till it became easy and convenient and popular. And that's, I think, the biggest joke in history that we're finding out about. Like, oh, how did that happen in Western media while it had all that integrity? You can't be the executioner and the judge in the case and then write the rules for yourself. You can't. And that's exactly what was happening. And those rules were written for brown and Black people, minorities, and not even minorities, but just like anyone in the global South knows this. So it became very clear that the more I push for any coverage of what is happening in Gaza, the genocide, even my colleagues in Gaza had the same exact encounter. They would risk their life covering news, and then once the news is sent and filed, well, no, we have to kill it because it's not verified. You literally have an eyewitness who's also a journalist who knows everything about how this work is done, and you're just saying that they are not credible. A lot of news agencies were not working directly with Palestinian photographers or journalists, but they were working with Israeli ones. So it just kept accumulating more and more of insane arguments to have at a time of genocide, at a time where like our families are getting slaughtered, and we have to prove why they were getting slaughtered. I felt like we were getting killed twice. And in the first week, like, I had 3 agencies really just come to the full screen: NPR, Wall Street Journal, and another one. And it was just so violent. It was very, very violent, the way that they decided to rip us out, like not even sideline us. It was very intentional and was done with so much prejudice that I could not understand. I think that was what shocked me the most.
You know, Iman, you already touched on this, but when it comes to the double standard of having Israeli soldiers on the byline or leading these newsrooms, Sana, you've talked about this a lot. Can you give us some insight on what does that look like in the newsroom? Is there any pushback at all? Are they protected? Like, what does that look like there? The other thing is, you know, one of the quotes that you've had in the article that has really, you know, a lot of people resonated with is how it's more tragic for newsrooms to enmesh themselves with the state without even being asked. Explain to us what's going on in the newsrooms right now.
Okay, so I'll start with the second part of your question, the kind of quote, and I've said this again and again, which I think that the greatest tragedy is a press that voluntarily enmeshes itself with the interests of the state and the state itself, without any kind of coercion, right? Because I think that is also the indicator of the least free population, that even with that freedom, that they're still willing to do that. And I don't think there's a greater example of that than, especially, not exclusively, but especially since October 2023, what our news media in this country has done, which is, again, not only enmeshed itself with the interests, and I do think it's, it's important that we remember that Israeli interests oftentimes are American interests, right? As opposed to maybe Israeli interests dictating American interests, and that's a whole other conversation to have. But not only has our news industry enmeshed itself with the interests of the U.S. government, but also enmeshed itself with, and oftentimes, sometimes overriding Americans themselves and what they have to say, and what their, poll after poll after poll is showing us that Americans, both on the right and on the left, are want an arms embargo, do not support Israel anywhere near that they did before 2023. Our news media is not reflecting that. Instead, is reflecting Israeli government interests. I mean, even you will there will be things, and I don't want to give any credit to Israeli press, but there will be things that are said in Israeli press that even our press here will never even touch upon, right? Including how many Israelis were killed on October 7th by Israeli weapons themselves, which is something that's been confirmed, although only to a small extent, by former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and also Israeli news media. So I think, like, in that context, right, what's happened in the last 2 years with our news media is terrifying, right? That it's, again, voluntarily said, yes, we will push forward these narratives and these interests of our government, and also this other government as well. Which I think, when you look at it that way, the partnership and the appointment of Barry Weiss into her position right now is part and parcel of that trajectory as well. It can't be seen as something separate, right? What with the whole, Larry Ellison takeover of our news media as well, and also with TikTok, all these things are part and parcel of that. So that was the second part of your question. Regarding the first part, Israelis, and especially those who have any kind of a relationship with the Israeli regime, with the Israeli military, absolutely are leading coverage and stories about, and this of course predates October 2023, right? But especially since then, they are leading the stories and what that narrative looks like. They're shaping it in U.S. newsrooms, and this is nowhere more apparent than let's say, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and CNN to an extent. I think sometimes in CNN, you can see that there's a bit of a back and forth happening, and there's a difference between online, digital print, and of course, like what's happening with the primetime shows and so on and so forth. But some of the biggest stories that we've seen that have been allowed to be told in our news industry have the bylines of former IDF soldiers, right? Iman already mentioned, right, Jeffrey Goldberg, who is a former IDF prison guard. Not only that, but the prison, I'm forgetting the name of the prison that was at, but the prison that he actually volunteered, he left the United States, volunteered with the IDF, and volunteered to be a prison guard. It's the same prison where several of the Global Samud Flotilla humanitarians are actually have been also held captive by the Israeli military. Not only do you have that, I mean, one example I think is very always important to use, because it was used to dismantle Gaza's humanitarian aid system, was the UNRWA story. Right, the UNRWA story, which came out in around, I mean, there were little, whispers before we could see, like, Israeli propagandists putting it out there, but on January 29th of 2024, the Wall Street Journal dropped a story claiming that around 10% of UNRWA's that there was a dossier that they had that revealed that 10% of UNRWA's members actually had familial links and ties to members of Hamas and PIJ and other Palestinian militant groups. And there were two bylines, and one of the bylines on this article was a journalist by the name of Carrie Kellerlin. And I just was like, I wonder, all you have to do oftentimes is Google people on any of these bylines, and you're able to immediately find out what their connection is to the IDF. Carrie Lynn Keller herself was a former 2 years prior to 2023 was doing a podcast called Israeli Trek, I believe, which was dedicated to showing the good side of Israel and promoting Israel in the American consciousness and promoting, the IDF as well. Her former roommate and also her podcast co-host was someone who specifically worked in a section of the IDF which was about propaganda. How do we get out good information? How do we get onto, podcast type spaces, online digital spaces, and spread stories that are actually showing what Israel is all about? Of course, every single, New York Times bureau chief is or has a connection to the IDF, to Israel. Most of the reporters, the New York Times, who are covering what is happening on the ground are them living in Israel or they have children who serve in the IDF as well. We know that the New York Times bureau chief lives in a house that it was purchased actually by Thomas Friedman, but it's a house from where a Palestinian family was displaced in 1948 as well. So even the New York Times, Jerusalem bureau chief will be living in a home where a Palestinian family was displaced from and it was stolen land. And this is something that's very, very common. The idea that we even bring up, and this has already been touched by several people already, by everyone else here, but the idea that we even bring up, right, like Palestinians are not allowed whatsoever to not just tell their story, but to even just be reporters. They're not allowed to be reporters because they're always looked at suspect, right? And this has as much to do with race as much as it has to do with the claims that are also made to that land, right? And to jump off of something that Abdullah was saying earlier about how, even the way we think about and talk about Palestinian freedom is so abstract. Even Palestinian death and life are made so abstract. And that is also that's at the core of this. That's at the core of also the Palestinian journalist experience in this industry as well, is that they exist as an abstract, and on that abstract there is a projection of all the most vile dehumanization that you can also consider as well. And because of that, they can never be, them or anyone who is Arab or Muslim or reads as Arab and Muslim, who reads as sympathetic, to people undergoing ethnic cleansing, genocide, occupation, immediately becomes suspect, as opposed to those who are actually directly tied to the institutions, to the militaries that are overseeing this genocide and whatnot. Instead, those people, of course, deserve our empathy and they can be objective journalists, whereas Palestinian journalists, Arab journalists, Muslim journalists, again, anyone who reads us sympathetic. And there's so many. I want to point out that, your report also mentioned this, and it's been mentioned already, but there are so many journalists who are not coming from Arab and Muslim and Palestinian communities who have talked about how much discrimination that they have faced, how that their beat was covering, the Middle East, and how they were taken off. As soon as they were like, hey, we should talk about, like, they want to talk about starvation in Gaza well before it became popular to do so, back in, what was it, like May of 2024, right? This is when everyone here started talking about starvation, like May or June, everyone, as in like politicians, celebrities, etc. And they were taking off those beats, and they were told, you're too close to the story. And, I had one individual tell me, he was like, I'm Indian. I'm an Indian Hindu. What do you mean I'm too close to the story? What does that mean? Right? And yeah.
No, thank you for mentioning that, because I think the most surprising thing for me, which I did not expect at all, is that a number of journalists I spoke to, only one was named, more, that was a more perfect union, but a number of the newsrooms, the journalists I spoke to were in newsrooms you would not expect any form of bias, censorship, or silencing on Palestine. It was progressive newsrooms, international newsrooms who generally appear to be good uncovering, the oppressed. And it was exactly as you said, you're too close to the story. We're not interested in this, et cetera, et cetera. Abdullah, there are some questions oh, there are some questions in the chat. I want to
I want to mention.
Go ahead. I think it's lagging.
Yeah, I just lagged a little bit there. I just want to quickly also mention is that, what you said about that there are international newsrooms, progressive newsrooms where you still find this. And I think that again speaks to just the depth and breadth of not only the dehumanization of Palestinians, but also how for so many people, your newsroom can be very progressive, but oftentimes we know this if you've worked ever in a newsroom, how much it comes down to your individual editors, right? What's the mood of your editor? What's the politics of your editor as well? What are they willing to push for? What are they not willing to push for? And one of the things that's become very clear is how protective people are within our industry and of course outside of it, but especially within our industry, how protective everyone is of the comforts of the world that they exist in as themselves as individuals, right? Unwilling to actually push the boundaries that by boundaries I mean literally just doing journalism, but really push the boundaries of what needs to be pushed with regards to this story. And exactly, there's so many more stories that I don't think will see the light of day anytime soon, because there's so much also fear of retaliation from and this industry is small, right? Like this industry is very small, and you speak out against a newsroom, even if you don't mention what that newsroom is, people can surmise like what the newsroom is and whatnot. You know that you're doing that with the threat of what could be the remainder of your career as well. There are also so many journalists, Arab and Muslims and others, who've left the industry because they said what they needed to say, they pushed where they needed to push, and then they realized that this is it. I can't go further than this. And do I stay within an industry which is directly complicit in the extermination, and not indirectly, directly complicit in the extermination of 2.2 million people, and also in the annexation and destruction of the West Bank? Or do I need to step out now and save what I can of my moral soul and whatnot? Did we lose Laura?
We did. She's gonna jump back on.
Okay.
I'm just going to a quiet place. I'm going to ask the next question for Abdullah. We've got some really great questions in the chat, so it'll be a good transition into this portion. Okay, great. So with respect to the foreign press ban, I'm wondering, this is from an anonymous attendee. I can't think of any other conflict that the U.S. reporters as foreign press have simply not attended. And I'm wondering about your thoughts on the foreign press ban and how much it has affected the coverage and how much that foreign press ban matters, or if parachuting and U.S.-based reporters would not have made much of a difference in the coverage.
I mean, that's a great question. And there are a couple layers to that. One is that, if we're just talking about the US media, there is obviously a special responsibility on US newsrooms to cover Gaza because it would not be possible without the US government to do this. So it's not just a matter of holding Israel accountable, but to hold their own government accountable. So that's why there is a kind of special onus on American newsrooms to do everything that they can to cover this fairly and try to be there on the ground. Obviously, there's been a ban on foreign journalists going in. Whether or not that matters, I think there are two parts to this. One is it shows you, how there are so many journalists who are in Gaza, and they are the reasons we know what's happening. They just also happen to be Palestinians. As a result, a lot of these newsrooms don't take them at their word or don't treat them as journalists in their own right, but unreliable narrators that you need to kind of have more proof than just the word of a journalist. Meanwhile, if it was an American journalist, like a white American journalist who was in Gaza who said something, then their word carries much more weight than if it was a Palestinian Al Jazeera journalist, for example. And so what I'm trying to say is that on the surface, it shouldn't matter because we have so many journalists who are putting their lives who have put their lives hundreds of journalists have been killed, who have put their lives at risk, who continue to put their lives at risk, their families' lives at risk every single day to tell the truth and tell the story of what's happening. And their word isn't taken or is always taken with a grain of salt from Western newsrooms, and that's a problem. Now, I do think that banning foreign journalists is a real problem because it's not just a matter of, needing to trust Palestinians, but it's also a matter of just having as many journalists from the world as possible to witness atrocities in real time. I'm not of the view that it has to be a Palestinian to tell the story of what's happening in Gaza. What we need is a good journalist, any good journalist to go in and tell the story, whether they are Palestinian or whether they are not. Now, there are plenty of good journalists in Gaza who are doing this already. And if it happens to be foreign journalists as well, all the better. Because the more people you have on the ground covering atrocities, covering these mass crimes, covering a genocide unfold in real time, the more documentation that we will have in order to hold people accountable in the long term, if we are even able to do that ever. So it is a pressing issue. It is a real issue that this so-called democracy, the so-called only democracy in the Middle East, as the Western press had often categorized Israel, will not allow the foreign press to go in. As for whether or not U.S. journalists have been able to go into other conflicts around the world, the reality is that even when they have always hewed towards a U.S. government bias. When they covered Iraq, they were embedded with the U.S. military. These are people who they form natural bonds with as they were participating in a war because, they would be in a bunker with soldiers. Those soldiers then go up the ranks and they become generals and they become top Pentagon officials and they become friends. There's a reason why our newsrooms in the U.S. tend to take the Pentagon really seriously with little skepticism. They tend to view protesters with more skepticism than they do uh, 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 the most major department of the United States, or the most consequential department of the United States. So, for example, there are oftentimes stories that are leaked in the press from generals, unnamed, anonymous sources. And the reason those run without much kind of background checking and fact checking on those stories is because the journalists are friends with those officials. And they run those stories, and oftentimes they're propaganda or untrue. And we've seen that happen time and time again. So it's not true necessarily that American journalists have always been present in other conflicts in a fair way. Oftentimes it's been in a deeply unfair way that has often actually served as a kind of part of as an arm for the American government's foreign policy apparatus. That's the purpose of oftentimes foreign correspondence in the United States, unwittingly so. Sometimes maybe not so, but sometimes it's unwittingly so that these journalists believe that they're, holding the powerful to account, and telling truth to power. But in reality, what they're doing is they're serving the state, and that kind of goes into why we see these patterns of us using the language that the state uses, why we use Israel's language and not Palestinians' language, why we oftentimes use the language of the oppressed and not the language of the oppressor. Like I was saying earlier, when I was a kid, the amount of times you saw the word Palestine mentioned in the press, which we now see a little bit more for different reasons, but Palestine was never mentioned. The word Palestine was never mentioned. It was always just Palestinian territories. So there is an urgent need to actually have foreign journalists in Gaza to document for the mere reason that we need as many journalists as we can when one of the worst atrocities of our lifetime is happening, to document as much as we possibly can. So that's the reason. The other reason is that really bothers me is that the one area where journalists in America feel comfortable being political, if they're not opinion journalists, where they feel comfortable taking a political stand, is the First Amendment and a free press. And anytime there's an assault on the free press, we march in lockstep and do campaigns to make sure that there's, some light shed on this. Meanwhile, hundreds of journalists are killed, intentionally killed and targeted, by the state of Israel. Our newsrooms are not allowed to go in and report on what's happening on the ground, and nary a peep from these newsrooms about freedom of the press, and the right to do journalism, and hold the powerful to account. So that's one of the double standards that has been so pervasive over the last 2 years. And one of the most frustrating things of witnessing this industry, of which I am a part, kind of completely turn a blind eye to our colleagues in Gaza who are getting killed, whose families are put at risk, whose lives are still at risk, and we are, as an industry, silent on that assault on the free press like we have not seen in this century. And you know, for the mere fact that they are Palestinians, unreliable narrators, that's the only reason, and the fact that the person oppressing them, the entity doing the assault on the press here is the state of Israel, one of the closest allies to the United States, which again, I always ask, who do we work for? Do we work for the state? Are we state run? Who are we interested in serving? And that's one of the most frustrating aspects of all of this.
Thank you so much for that, Abdullah. And thank you, Shabnam, for stepping in. My computer crashed because of what we're talking about. So thank you, Prism. They've given us a few more minutes, and thanks everyone who's still here. This will be recorded, of course, for those who need to step out. But Aline, there's a few questions in the chat I also want to pose. Two of them, if you can touch on. How much of this is fueled by readers and viewers, this bias? I know that you've, in the visuals that Visualizing Palestine have created, you've also touched on the headlines, the type of terminology that's being used, the imbalance, basically, of all of that. How much of that is pushed through by viewers, by a lobby, by executives? Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Laura. Yeah, and I'll keep the answer brief. And I think that you touch on this quite extensively in the article that you wrote for Prism, and that whole idea around a lot of the journalists that you interviewed touch on how the reason that newsrooms sort of preemptively start censoring themselves is because they know that they'll get pushback from their audience, right? And they'll get and this is always so mind-boggling to me, because I think also for us as Palestinians and as people who have been oppressed for a very long time, we kind of internalize that we live with it, and then we're like, so when we respond, it's like when it's really egregious, but we take the small wins. Oh, they mentioned Palestinians, so that's great, and it's like the bare minimum. And so even at the bare mention, we're like, okay, we'll take the crumbs. And I feel like this is not true when it comes in general, actually, from the right as well. So we see newspapers, we see news agencies being attacked every time that they mention Palestinians, even from the Zionists, from the right in general. And this was one of the things that you included in the report, where journalists were saying that there is so much drama, right, in the newsroom, in the editorial room, because there is this tension between what the journalists want to report on, if they've experienced this violence, or they're from certain communities, and what their editors are allowing them to report on, is because of this huge pushback that's coming from Zionist forces, and I think also because these groups have been organizing for a very long time to push back. There are groups that are focused just on that, right? Camera is one of them, and you mentioned them as well in the report, where this is what they do. That we don't have organizations in the Palestinian movement that are doing this kind of pushback, and we also don't have the bullying that's happening. There's bullying, there's threats that are happening, right? There's all of these tactics that make newsrooms so fearful of how they're going to report on Palestine or other issues, that have to do with racial justice, with LGBTQ issues, with Black lives. So I think we've definitely, included that in also in the when we worked on this visual with Prism, but also quite extensively covered in your article, Laura, and encourage people to really look into that and question, when do we actually step in as viewers? Why are we passive viewers? Why are we passive readers? We need to also hold the newspapers and the news agencies accountable for this repression that they're doing, and the complicity that they're part of.
100%. I always say this to people, like the media at the end of the day is working for us. We're the ones who are consuming that news. We're the ones subscribing to that news. And it works if we call them in and say, hey, I haven't heard from so and so, or send in letters. If we can organize ourselves to do that. I've seen it work in DC during the Sheikh Jarrah protests, when people were speaking up. A lot of local radio were just bringing on Israeli spokespersons from the government. And I remember there was a community member who said, hey, like, I called them in. I said, I haven't heard from a Palestinian. And they said, well, do you know one? And they recommended two people that I knew. So, like, you know what I mean? So there's also these little things of, like, sometimes a lot of it is systemic, a lot of it is ignorance at the same time, and lack of access, lack of resources, and people that just follow the big media because they think the big media is right. I think for us to wrap this up, if folks can touch on the way forward. A lot of people in the chat, in the Q&A box, have asked, like, well, what does the future of journalism look like? What can we do moving forward? And part of that is also the question of, this is happening in newsrooms in the professional sphere sense, but is it also happening in student newsrooms? A question I haven't really looked into, but have any of you spoken to students? I do know that I mean, they arrested Rasmi for writing an op-ed, and she wasn't even a student journalist, right? Just the act of freely expressing an opinion. But I also remember when students were covering the encampment at UCLA, they faced violence and harassment, and they were called into hearings. So this is across the board. I think maybe going back to you, Iman, what is the way forward for this industry?
I think it's overdue, the fact that people have the tools to be informed. Like, the raising awareness phase is way over, and people have the tools to be informed about the information they are consuming, the agencies that they are consuming it through, and so on and so forth. And there has to be a distinction between journalists and for-profit media, which at that point we're talking about a lot of the most popular mainstream media agencies. It's just like, it's in the name, it's for profit. It's fueled by the clicks, likes, views, and not necessarily because that's what the audience wants, but that's what they've been, like, moving towards for such a long time. And they often treat their audience as idiots, really. Like, they minimize the ability to imagine an intelligent audience so much that anyone, if they pay attention, would be so offended. So it's very important to do from the audience part, but also our own as journalists. As Sana said, a lot had been, not, I mean, some had been moving out of the field completely because they feel like it's hopeless, and it's this continuous I don't know, it's just like arguing about what's sane and what's insane, and it makes no sense at the end of the day. But I would have a heart attack thinking leaving the field for, IDF, ex-IDF soldiers, IDF reserves, and people who are fueled and interested in just making, I don't know what it is, fame or money. Can tell you, our industry does not bring a lot of money. So if you're not in it for the core values of what it stands for, you're not in it at all, and it would be doing us all a favor to get out. But I also understand when people got so frustrated with this back and forth and found different roles for themselves in other places. I think that make empowering journalism comes from us challenging power, like where the check and balances. And if that is not there, and that applies to everything else, from the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is the biggest bullshit in the entire of our journalism field in America. But also, if you want to get the news, you need to listen to those who have it firsthand. And just like Abdullah said, if we take that badge of credible and put it on anyone that we like, and we take it off those who actually are firsthand witnessing what is happening, we will never have news. We will always have propaganda. So it's a mutual it goes both ways. It's a mutual thing. It's between us and the audience and the people who are receiving whatever. If you want Fox News, go ahead and listen to Fox News. But if you want the news, you better be involved and actually not be so passive and so distanced and so, oh, I don't engage with politics. Well, what politics will engage with you? So whether you like it or not, it's gonna come and find you. And thankfully for the U.S. interfering in every global South country that ever existed and destabilizing them, now Americans are finding themselves dealing firsthand with the consequences of the American governments across the history. So, and now with the genocide, I honestly believe strongly that the way to combat propaganda is not to just point it out, but empower the journalists on the ground and the ones who are holding on to the values of this mission, so much so that for profit media becomes unpopular, that you just know it by the name. CNN is for profit media. We all know that, but we act like they're holy gods coming down with, with their status to just like give us some updates on the world. That's not how it works at all. And it's such an insane time that honestly there's, again, no catalog, no manual of how we can proceed. But I know that we need to start with agreeing on the facts, not the narratives, not the opinions. And when you have lists and lists of IDF soldiers writing your news, that's not the facts. And Zionist propaganda is pretty good at it, because, or were, now they're actually pretty lazy, but they often attach the words like honest reporting to manufacturing propaganda and false information and disinformation. And they do that under those like small labels of honest or the free media, or and we can't be this naive. We just cannot be this naive.
Yeah. Thank you, Iman. Unfortunately, Erin had to jump off, but Sana, what are your conclusions? Sana, are you here?
Oh, sorry, you cut off there for me.
Oh, no worries. Go ahead. Yeah.
Regarding the future of the media, I actually have a very bleak look and kind of outlook on all these things. It's so in 2024, Gallup released a poll showing that overall American trust in the US news media industry was at 31%. It's actually remained pretty steady over the last 4 or 5 years. We see that more and more Americans are turning away from what we'll call, right, legacy media, mainstream media, and are turning instead towards more individualized or alternative forms of media, for better or for worse, right? I don't think we can blanket statement that all alternative media or independent media, or whatever, like whether it's a podcast or a newsroom, independent newsroom or whatever, is, not great, etc. And I think that there's a tendency sometimes amongst traditional journalists to do that, to kind of really dismiss alternative media, as opposed to looking at why is it that alternative media is taking taking the information war online by the storm that it is. I think that given the last 2 years, one of the things that the last 2 years have done have really revealed the rot at the core of so many of our institutions, not only in this country, but around the world. And I don't think that the rot at the core of our US news industry has been as revealed as blatantly as it's been revealed in the last 2 years. I'm old enough to remember, as I'm sure a lot of people are here as well, what the coverage of the Iraq War looked like. When we look at even just the first 6 months of what prior to the invasion of Iraq, what it looked like, it was bad. It was extremely bad in terms of what was allowed to be said. And I can say this, I mean, I can say this confidently, with full confidence, that I think still the first 3 months of the genocide in Gaza, the coverage of it was worse than even those 6 months leading up to the invasion of Iraq, right? Just because of what has been allowed to happen since. No one there, not a single, well, I guess except for Judith Miller to an extent from the New York Times, but like there was no one held accountable for the lies that were spread that allowed for the invasion and destruction of Iraq and the subsequent, slaughter of hundreds of thousands, if I mean someone would say upwards of 1 million people, not just in Iraq, but across the region, the destabilization that happened of several countries since then as well. There was no mechanism or mode of accountability for our news industry then. And right now there isn't either. In fact, the only real mechanism or mode of accountability that we have is from individual news consumers turning away from the industry. And so I think what we're going to see in the next few years is our newsrooms are going to see a lot more crumbling happen. And we see this happening a little bit already with the kind of acquiescence that's happened, capitulation that's happening to Trump administration as well, right? When you have, I mean, the news about, for instance, Barry Weiss, right, being hired as a news editorial director for CBS News should absolutely make the skin crawl of not just every journalist, but every American news consumer in terms of what that signifies and what era of the news industry we're entering right now. So my perspective, unfortunately, is that it's not looking too good for our news industry in terms of legacy news, in terms of mainstream news. And that may not necessarily be a bad thing in some respect, but I do think that alternative news spaces, independent news spaces are going to be where we need to be looking. And that's where, to echo what Iman says, that's who we need to empower. We need to empower journalists on the ground who are doing the work in the communities that they're doing it. And we need to support independent journalists that we support as well. And also make sure we're building media literacy. There are a lot of us journalists, like myself included, and others who are focused not necessarily on reporting on what's happening, but reporting on how it's being reported on, right? Because we understand how, with all the information that's being thrown at us on an hourly basis, more than ever before, we need to understand how to read and consume the news that we are receiving.
Thank you for that, Sana. And I don't know if folks can share in the chat the Movement Media Alliance link as well. It has a good list of alternative media that folks can actually go to for news. Abdullah.
Thank you. I mean, I think, I have had my ups and downs working in this industry of optimism and pessimism and going back and forth, naivete and then being idealistic about what it could be, and then being more realistic over the last 2 years about what it is. That said, to Sena's point, like there will always be a source of information out there. There's always going to be journalism will always exist. The question is like, what will it look like? And I think there is a lot of reason to be concerned right now, if that hasn't been evident already, but, it seems to just be getting worse because, even though like the way that Palestinians are covered now, is a little bit more humane than it was, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. The only reason that's the case is because, the horror is undeniable at this point, and it still continues to cover up, the guilty party here, and what's actually happening, and softening the language around Israel and its crimes. The fact that it's accused of genocide doesn't often come up in stories about what's happening. The fact that that's the growing consensus among experts, and the fact that organizations Palestinian, Israeli, international human rights organizations have come to that conclusion still, is absent in a lot of news stories. So even though like you can see a little bit more humanity in some of these stories, it's still very bleak, looking at the coverage overall now, because it's like it's like in spite of the last 2 years, we're still this far from covering Palestinians in a fair, just all we're asking for is fairness in a fair way. And so, there's also more reason to be concerned, as Senna said, with the capitulation of media conglomerates to the Trump administration. Yeah, and as Senna mentioned earlier, there's the U.S. media, even though we have a free press, technically, kind of toes the state party line, even though we have the freedom not to. And there are a lot of reasons for that, including how these organizations make money, who owns them, all of these conflicts of interests that are just antithetical to good journalism. So there are a lot of reasons to be concerned. But I think that because journalism will always exist, I think it's important for it's not just news consumers, but anybody who's interested in being a journalist, to do journalism in whatever capacity they feel, is something that they can stand by ethically, morally, all those things. So if the big newsrooms, the legacy newsrooms, are too far gone, and write a blog or do independent media or whatever, but like do the story, like tell the story if you can afford to, if you can figure out a way to do journalism in whatever capacity. If you have deep pockets, any of you here, and want to fund new newsrooms, do it. Like, we need as many sources of information as we can get, and the better storytellers that are out there, the better the information would be. I think for me, it's also a plea to journalists in Western newsrooms, who to this day continue to dehumanize Palestinians. One of the most devastating, I think, aspects, and I think hurtful ways that we have seen how thoroughly Palestinians have been dehumanized over the last 2 years, and well before that as well, is the punditry around why, for example, college students care about Palestinians and why these protests are cropping up. And this idea that there's this kind of inherent leftism in supporting the Palestinian cause. And that may well be true, but there's this idea that like seeing pictures of babies completely, I mean, torn apart, and human beings, men, women, babies, children, entirely torn apart, bombs, starving to death. And there's this punditry about how young people don't care about, uh, they don't really care about Palestine. There's this kind of emotional detachment that they don't really care about the Palestinian cause. It's just kind of in vogue now in certain circles, or that it's about winning factional power within the Democratic Party and all that stuff. And all that it requires is being a human being and understanding the human emotion attached to seeing the destruction of Gaza and feeling emotional about it, like a slight bit of emotion about it, and feeling the need to act on it. And the more we see that in our newsroom, the worse it's going to get. And that's why I would always encourage people who, have empathy, people who feel strongly about justice, people who don't just care about telling the truth, but care about why they are telling the truth. The idea that our job is about delivering justice, about uncovering injustice, about delivering freedom, and all of these fundamental principles and human rights that we all aspire to have and have equal access to around the world. That if that's the story you're interested in doing, do it. And I'm not optimistic. I think in the near future, I think there's a lot of reasons to be pessimistic, but I think I have an optimism bias inherently, innately, I don't know, in the long term. So again, this might not be a project for our lifetime, but there's a reason why it's important to continue telling the stories today and every day, because so long as we tell them, they will exist in some capacity, no matter how hard people try to destroy them. There's a power in just telling the story, however which way you can. And so if you're interested and frustrated with the media, participate in it in whatever capacity you can, in whatever way you can find, and at whatever cost it might come if if that's not of concern. Like that's something that I think people really should do. And so the fact that I think inherently I believe in the goodness of people, and I think inherently the I think the majority of people are good, and if those people, more good people, do journalism, I think we would be better off. And that's my hope, that's my dream. But obviously there is like all these institutional barriers to entry and institutional barriers to doing good journalism. But that's just something that we have to keep fighting against, no matter how tired the fight seems.
Yeah, thank you, Abdullah, and thank you all for really sharing and for your insights. I think it's important for us to continue to have this conversation, especially right now, especially to educate viewers and news consumers, as you said, Sana. We have, still about 50 people with us virtually and online and in person, about 30. So thank you for sticking around as well. I guess what I'll end with, what I started is, when I started this, I said like journalism, it should be a conviction. And when you ask a lot of journalists, why did you become a journalist? A lot of them have personal stories of communities that they want to cover. And I think that in the same way that a double standard is applied in the newsroom of what you cannot cover, I think it gets applied to Palestinian journalists who say, well, I want to be a journalist to talk about the stories of my family, of my community, of my people. And I think it's important to really recognize that. And that's my personal conviction, that the story of my community for the past 77 years has been overshadowed by statements and headlines and news segments that do not represent the real story, that do not represent the truth. And we see it again today. It is October 7, 2025, 2 years into the genocide. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been impacted, killed, displaced, targeted, traumatized. It's enough. And it's enough for the journalists that are in these newsrooms that are manufacturing the consent. I think one thing we can take from the investigation, from this conversation, is the individuals here, the individuals that I spoke to, said something in their newsroom, said something in their community, said something to their peers that actually, I will use ethnic cleansing as part of a quote, like Farah, who I interviewed in the story, or Ziad, who knew that the pro-Israel lobby was going to attack him for bringing up a particular topic in their network, and he was prepared with the answers, and he was prepared to push back. Or Nadia, who, despite being told there's before October 7 and after October 7, continued to pitch stories about Palestine, not giving up. I think when we talk about disruption, it doesn't have to be associated with a negative connotation. If I've learned anything from my grandmother, from my family, is that disruption means people who have lost hope, who feel abandoned by the world, can still be seen, that there's somebody out there still pushing forward, fighting for them. And we need to keep doing this. The genocide has to stop, and we can stop it with the narratives that we are putting out there, by telling the truth and documenting the crimes that are happening. So thank you all again for being here. Thank you for speaking to us today, and have a good night.